Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul. Hopefully you're having an amazing day. I'm going to kick this video off with the RTX 3080 Ti and a release date. Yep, we have yet another release date for this card. And for people wondering, yes, this card has undergone some significant delays. In fact, this GPU should have already been released, but Nvidia postponed it. To my knowledge, it should have launched around January. In fact, there was even some murmurs that it should have launched in December, but Nvidia internally delayed it. And then basically, over Christmas, they had a plan in mind, but then they kind of changed it last minute. And now here we are. So while this card should have launched just after the 3060 Ti, well, yeah, things have changed somewhat. Anyway, according to my drivers, we're going to see this GPU launch in April, which tallies up very nicely to an exclusive I had the other day, where I said that yes, this card is going to be launching in April. Although, to be accurate, my drivers are saying that Nvidia are going to announce the card in April. So it's possible that the launch date is going to be a week or so after this. It's a very interesting time in the GPU market, of course, because of shortages. And this is one of the reasons, to my knowledge, that the RTX 3080 Ti has been delayed a little bit, because Nvidia don't want to just launch this card and then no one will be able to get hold of it. With that said, I do suspect that the availability of this GPU isn't going to be as high as, let's say, with the RTX 3060 or 3060 Ti, which was actually pretty damn, it had decent quantities of the GPU. To my knowledge, in the UK, there was around 12 to 15,000 of those particular GPUs going around retailers. To be clear, this is not just on Nvidia.com. So availability of their cards was pretty good. Unfortunately, they've just been selling out like hotcakes. Oh, and I'm going to quickly just tackle this right now because I wasn't going to forget. Speaking of Nvidia and the 3060, there was a report that people had bypassed the mining protections on the GPU to mine Ethereum. And this was not actually accurate. It was technically mining, but it was mining another currency, which wasn't Ethereum. Of course, you can argue that the mining locks, and this is my personal opinion as well, they probably didn't go far enough. I know that that's going to depend on the side of the mining fence that you're on. But yeah, it hasn't been bypassed yet. I think eventually it will be bypassed. That's my personal opinion. But I think it's going to take a lot longer than that. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe tomorrow there will be a legitimate hack for the RTX 3060 for Ethereum mining. But as of the time I'm recording this video, it has not been bypassed. Getting back though to the 3080 Ti, we're going to be hopping backwards and forwards here like a frog. Yeah, with the 3080 Ti, the specs are not confirmed yet. And, my drivers are not sure whether it's a 12 or 20 gigabyte GPU. I'm personally leaning towards a 12 gigabyte model. This is what Copy7 Kimi has also reported. I believe it's a 12 gigabyte card. However, again, Papa Jansen has not only been changing his mind on the release date, the specs have also been in turmoil. And of course, one of the reasons that they did this is because of the RX 6900 XT, and also just trying to figure out what would be best so they don't completely and utterly cut the legs out of the RTX 3090. And this is another reason I think that the card is going to be a 12 gigabyte GPU, because to my knowledge, a couple of my sources at Nvidia, they basically were struggling to how they would even promote the RTX 3090, because, there was one time at Bandcamp where the RTX 3080 Ti and 3090 were almost identical in spec, albeit with the 3090 having a slightly wider memory bus, but of course 24 gigabytes of memory compared to just 20 gigabytes of memory on the 3080 Ti. But most people are not going to be like, well, gee, that 4 gigabytes of memory. Even prosumers are not going to most likely pay $300, $400, $500 more for the privilege of owning a 3090. So it would have basically killed the RTX 3090. So I think that's another reason that we're almost certainly going to be getting a 12 gigabyte card. Also, since I'm talking about availability and upcoming cards, I did want to also pick on the 6700 XT for just a moment. So I mentioned just a few moments ago that the RTX 3060 and 3060 Ti had a substantial retail presence in the UK. I was told that it was way over 10,000 GPUs. It was probably more like 12 to 15,000. But again, that is not including Nvidia's own Founders Edition GPUs. These are shipped to retail. The thing is, that there is such a demand for GPUs at the moment, even outside of mining. Everyone just wants to buy a card, and it's not like in a normal market you would be like, I want a Rolls Strix, whatever card you want, so 3070 or 3090 or whatever. But now it's not like that. It's like, does it have a display port? Does it work? I'm buying it. So even people who perhaps would want to buy a 4K GPU, you can make a really good argument, just buy the 3060 Ti if you can, just sit on it, and then you can buy a 3080 Ti or whatever in the future. And I know people who have done that. Like a friend of mine bought an RTX 3070, not because he wanted the 3070, he wanted the 3080, but it's just like, well, the 3070 is available, what are you going to do? Anyway, getting back to the point. So I'm hearing with the 6700 XT, it will definitely have higher availability compared to the 6800 XT, which to my knowledge had about 250 to 500 cards in the UK. Again, that is not AMD's web front though, that is just retail availability across the entire UK. I'm hearing it's more than that for the 6700 XT. AMD themselves promised substantial increase in the number of GPUs available. I'm hearing it's around 1,000, possibly 2,000 for the initial launch week, but AMD are going to continue to restock throughout the launch period. So every month, basically, they're going to get a similarly sized shipment, if I can speak. So that should mean that they have better presence than what they did with the 6800 XT and other cards, but it's still not brilliant. And one of the reasons that, of course, we saw this shortage is because their foundries are just being, well, TSMC's foundries are just being absolutely hammered at the moment, because AMD, of course, also provides their allotment to Sony and Microsoft, and obviously they had to make those commitments, so they couldn't have as much production capacity for their own products, and of course their GPUs are one of those products. And finally, I really want to talk about the Switch Pro. There is a lot of reports at the moment concerning the Switch Pro, and of course one of the more infamous is that it is going to support DLSS, and we're going to get into that in just a second, but I do think it's important for us to lay some groundwork. So the first is that there is also a report that the Switch, that is the regular vanilla Switch, is going to have its SOC become end of line, i.e. it's no longer going to be produced. And that does make me wonder whether Nintendo are gearing up to stop producing the Switch altogether, as there's yet another leak that the Switch Pro, or Super Switch, or Switch Super, there's so many different variants of the codename, is also going to have exclusive games. To be clear, you know how the PS4 or whatever, you can plonk your game into the PS4 or the PS4 Pro, and of course the game will run just fine, same as on the Xbox One or Xbox, One X. So originally, it wasn't clear whether the Switch Pro was going to act very similarly, i.e. games were going to possibly have an update or dedicated, Switch Pro mode, which would allow them to take advantage of high resolution graphics and improve visuals, high frame rate, whatever. But no, this report seems to indicate that these games are going to be exclusive to the Switch Pro, so they will not work on your Switch. So let's move on to the new information concerning DLSS. Nate Drake on the Reset Era forums has confirmed that the Switch Pro is not going to have its upsampling tech in the Switch dock, rather it's part of the actual console itself. I personally believe that this is almost certainly true. Last year, I put out an exclusive to detail that Nintendo were internally testing two variants of a Switch successor or an upgraded Switch. It wasn't clear which one it was at that time, and both of those were basically updated Tegra SoCs, and to my knowledge, they were utilizing Tensor cores. We'll get into that in just a second. So I don't think that Nintendo would utilize a dock. There's a couple of reasons. One, it would increase the complexity of the Switch's design, which is something that Nintendo are very adverse to. I mean, technically you could do it. I mean, external GPUs do exist for the Mac and PC, but it would increase the complexity of the design, especially of the dock itself, which basically is just a dummy unit on the regular Switch. It's essentially just it's just there for I/O and, you know, providing power essentially. I mean, you can basically do the same thing yourself with a couple of bucks. You're really good at soldering. And so I think Nintendo wouldn't want to do that, because also it would mean if you wanted to have like another Switch in your home and you wanted to buy another dock, the dock itself would presumably be rather expensive to produce, as it would need its own, you know, kind of internals, its own GPU or whatever was inside of it. So instead, I believe that what Nintendo are going to do is much more like they did with the original Switch, i.e. if the device itself is not plugged into the dock, the clock frequencies will be lower on the CPU, GPU, maybe the RAM, and also they'll probably use aggressive clock gating across the entire SoC itself, possibly disabling the tensor cores. And the tensor cores are ultimately what are responsible for allowing the maths to run, which can upsample the image. So DLSS 2, of course, is for the PC right now, and DLSS 2 does a pretty stellar job. It's not perfect, but we'll get into that in just a second. However, you can upsample from like 720p to 1440p or even 4K. Ideally, though, you don't want to go from 720p to 4K. Ideally, it would be like 1080p to 4K, 1440p to 4K. I think a realistic scenario for the Switch would be 1080p and then upsample to like 4K, or maybe like 1080p to upsample to like 1440p, or 720p to upsample to 1440p. I'm assuming that will be configurable to the game's developers. I also believe that this is not necessarily to compete with Sony or Microsoft in power. That's not what Nintendo have done historically, and it's not what they're going to do essentially with a tweaked version of an Nvidia SoC. We'll get into the SoC names in just a second. I think instead this is for two reasons. The first is that the Xbox Series X, as well as the PlayStation 5, have vastly improved CPU performance over the Switch and tons of memory bandwidth. I don't think that you would really get the best ports from an Xbox Series X game, for example, to a Switch. The Switch is already heavily CPU bound, and it's a miracle games like Doom are working at all. Doom, Wolfenstein, it's a miracle those games are working. Like even Doom 2016, you're like, how is this thing not catching on fire? And the other reason too is that, yes, I know that people are not exactly buying a Switch for its graphical prowess, but you have to admit some games do look a bit ropey on a 4K display, so having even a modestly increased pixel count would probably help there. And, you know, the Switch is selling like hotcakes for Nintendo, but one of the reasons as well is that you can take those games in a portable fashion and then obviously play them in a subway or whatever, and that's obviously brilliant. Like when I was flying frequently to the US in the before 4 times, sad face, literally like Zelda and Mario Kart kept me sane on the long ass plane journey. That's a technical term as well, long ass. Anyway, getting back to my point then. So the Switch also having DLSS makes a ton of sense to me, given what we've seen with Nvidia. Nvidia really are doing the groundbreaking here for Nintendo, because obviously they've already implemented DLSS as a plugin for Unreal Engine. So that is probably just the beginning. They're going to be really pushing this in just about everything. At this point, I expect you to open up like YouTube and it's going to like say, do you want to use DLSS on YouTube? Obviously I'm kidding, but you get my point. Like they're pushing it for everything. And this is brilliant for Nintendo, but it's also brilliant that Nintendo are adopting DLSS for Nvidia, because I think that Nvidia, one of their strengths is going to be DLSS. To my knowledge, and I discussed this in a recent video yesterday, that Fidelity FX super sampling doesn't use machine learning as in like, training and inference, to my knowledge. Instead, it seems to be upsampling basically, as the frame is occurring. It seems to basically use something more like an older upsampling technique, such as, let's say, checkerboard rendering or some type of temporal reconstruction. It's not exactly clear on that. And then a very small amount of machine learning is applied afterwards. So Nvidia basically having a major company like Nintendo pushing DLSS into tons of different homes, it benefits them. It means that studios are going to be way more familiar with it, and I dare say that it's also going to improve Nvidia's own toolkits and development tools, and probably actually the quality of DLSS, because obviously Nintendo themselves are going to be cramming as much resources into learning how to optimize this thing. And this is probably going to be really good for low to mid-range GPUs. I don't know how much it will benefit us immediately, but for example, an RTX 30, or I guess 4060 would probably benefit very heavily in the next generation. So which version will Nintendo go with then? Will they go with Xavier or Orin, which are the two SOC variants which would have tensor cores? This is assuming, by the way, that the tensor core information with DLSS is accurate, although I'm pretty certain it is, because it's not just my information at this point. There are so many reports that Nintendo are pushing a 4K Switch, and realistically, given the portable nature of the Switch, it's really the only way that I can see that they would do it unless there really is hardware in the dock, and I don't think Nintendo would go that route. So again, what would they choose? Well, they've got Xavier or Orin. Xavier is volta-based, whereas Orin is ampere-based. And so you could immediately say, well, there you go then. They're going to go with the latest architecture. They're going to go with Orin. I don't think that's true. I think instead they would get a deal on the volta-based architecture. It would be cheaper for them to produce. The die isn't as complicated. So my personal takeaway with this, given we're not hearing any reports that the new Switch has hardware-based ray tracing as well, I think it's much more likely to be a volta-based SKU, and it would still be a pretty big upgrade over what they have with the Switch, particularly if they improve the amount of memory bandwidth as well, which was a big handicap for the original Switch. Not to mention the fact that anyway, the later Nvidia architectures have much better color compression, as they're using Maxwell for the current Switch, and the later Switch, obviously, the later Nvidia architectures such as Pascal have much better color compression, which saves a ton of memory bandwidth. So my guess is that it's probably going to be Xavier based, but of course that's just my opinions on that. We'll have to wait and see until we get an official confirmation. Again, though, this is an article, so if you want to check it out, you can find it, of course, linked in the video description. With that said, thank you very much for watching. Take care of yourselves. Have an amazing day. Bye for now.